This is the Open University.
I have never been to university, but there's one thing I love to see, the Open University of Mr. Momus. And if I graduate, he sure did earn his bonus.
Welcome back to the openest university there is, the University of Momus. And today we're reviewing a book by Johnny Johnston, which is called Through the Crack in the Wall, and it's the history of Josef K. Josef K, not the Kafka character, the bank clerk in the trial who's been arrested without having done anything wrong, but a group which existed for 4 years in the late 70s and early 80s, which gave rise to my music career by launching my band, The Happy Family, partly because they split up way too soon.
My name is Max Brot. It did not escape my attention that around 1980, musicians in the popular idiom were distilling my friend Franz Kafka's sensibility into their songs. I feel sure that Franz would have appreciated this in the same spirit in which he delighted in the productions of Loewy's Yiddish theatre troupe from Limburg. There was a certain David Bowie, dressed as the most beautiful clown in the circus, singing in Ashes to Ashes, "Want an axe to break the ice," a paraphrase of Francis saying that a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. There was Howard Devoto's Song from Under the Floorboards, judged by many to be his band Magazine's masterpiece, a song which gives voice to Gregor Samsa and places him in the landscape Dostoevsky sketched in Notes from Underground. The Edinburgh beat group Josef K took the influence furthest, however, not just in their choice of name, but in the lyrical content of countless songs. Crazy to Exist, Sense of Guilt, Final Request. N began to attend their concerts regularly, muffled in the padded blue army greatcoat his mother had brought back from her trip to China, a penguin edition of Francis' short stories stuffed into his pocket. Josef K played at the art school, at a so-called Frank Sinatra evening at Valentino's discotheque, or with Magazine at an old church hall above a rehearsal space called The Moon. The music was a brittle jangle, and the group, dressed in shirts buttoned up to their necks, looked genuinely Eastern European, like 4 tense, neurotic Czech waiters. They released their debut album, The Only Fun in Town, in the summer of 1981. It was a stark and rushed affair, recorded in 8 days in Brussels, a replacement for a lusher album they'd made at Edinburgh's Castle Sound Studios, deleted while it was still at the test pressing stage. It hadn't reflected the chaos and frenzy of their live sound, singer Paul Haig explained. The new Brussels recording came wrapped in a scratchy black and gold sleeve depicting Princess Street, with the dome of West Register House in Charlotte Square surrounded by crows. Just down the hill from that dome, in a mezzanine room his father let him use during the university holidays, N listened to this record, both local and glamorously cosmopolitan with its traces of Prague and Brussels, constantly. It had a frenetic yet oblique edge to it, a sense of brash and reckless vigilance, apparently caused by the consumption of too much speed and too many Velvet Underground records.
For me, it was the most exciting time imaginable, because I was a kind of nervous student, an existentialist, Kafka fan, and suddenly here was this local group called Josef K, with a singer who looked a bit like a sort of anorexic Franz Kafka with high cheekbones and a rather introverted personality, singing over what sounded like the Velvet Underground with, you know, John Cale on his viola. If you listen to it, it's kind of funny. Malcolm Ross is being John Cale playing the viola in that record. What I didn't know, although I'd been to all the band members' houses and could see a little bit how they lived and who they were, I didn't really know their backstory. So this book is invaluable for that. Thank you, Johnny, for sending me a complimentary copy. As someone quoted in the book, I got one of those. And I learned about their childhoods going to Firhill School together, which is a comprehensive school in South Edinburgh, a kind of tough school by the sound of it, where they were distinguished as kind of rather more genteel intellectuals, even a little bit too sensitive for the gangland kind of, you know, they all described the 70s as a rather violent and scary. Malcolm Ross's parents were fairly solid bourgeois. His dad was actually the principal of New College, the theological school in Edinburgh. So he came from a fairly solid background and was actually sort of bussed into the Firhill School from Morningside, which is, as anyone who's read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie knows, it's very proper. The flag at the castle is half-mast hay, part of Edinburgh. But none of them were quite as posh as me, who went to a miserable private school, which has since gained a rather notorious reputation for abusing its pupils in various ways, and who had a miserable time in boarding school at that academy, and whose only consolation at the time was David Bowie and Lou Reed records. So there was a sort of element in my interest in the group in kind of finding out what the Edinburgh experience was for people who hadn't come from my comfortable background, which actually was kind of Spartan and miserable if you were sent to boarding school, and had to learn Latin and had to march about in the school playground pretending to be soldiers and all the rest of it. But it was just tremendously exciting to see a local group who were not just sort of doing cover versions of Rolling Stones songs, or which tended to be the case, or doing like Blue-Eyed White Soul like the Average White Band, or teeny boppers like the Bay City Rollers. There were various kinds of ways you could be groups in Scotland, but there wasn't really a music industry to speak of before the indie labels of the late 70s and the 80s. So Stephen Daly, who was Orange Juice's drummer, I think initially, set up a label which Josef K put out their first single on, and thereafter Alan Horn, this sort of would-be Malcolm McLaren, Andy Warhol kind of Svengali character, whose homoerotic love for Edwin Collins, the singer in Orange Juice, basically was his major motivation for setting up this label, and who was always very ambivalent at the best about Josef K and thought that they were like a crap version of Joy Division or something. Very wrong, and it gets a bit of a bad press in this book because of his sharp tongue. Very kind of catty. Him and Edwin together could be devastatingly catty about their perceived competition, their rivals in the industry, or attacking John Peel, saying, listen up to this old man, this is where it's happening now.
There's no reason why we shouldn't operate from Glasgow. There's no reason why, if we wanted a major contract, the major companies shouldn't come out up here and bring the coals to Newcastle and the fish from the fire.
Peel did played both Josef K and Orange Juice, and gave them sessions and things, despite all that.
My name is Colin McInnes. It's no longer the 1950s, and N is no longer a teenager, but in the music game, he's an absolute beginner. Wet behind the ears, a soft Lord Snooty with his public school education and his semi-English accent. The lads from Josef K teach him their own brand of cool and show him their Edinburgh. There's Maisie, Josef K's driver, with his blue Citroën hatchback and svelte cheekbones. Maisie plays the drums first, then the Fender Jaguar. There's Davy Weddle, he was Josef K's bassist, and soon Ian Stoddart joins on drums. The boys take N to the Royal Mile Cafe with its cheap coffees and its big window overlooking the Kafkaesque cathedral. They drive him to the Victoria Cafe off Leith Walk, the only place in the Edinburgh of 1981 where you can get a proper cappuccino, or to the Tapper Lauriston pub next to the art school, where members of the fire engines hang out with firebrand actor Tamdene Byrne. There, the fiercely shy Paul Haig sits with one hand slipped into the half-hidden pocket of his Oxfam suit. Oddly, Haig chooses to tuck the jacket into his trousers. There's also the retro-styled City Cafe with its bottles of pills. It takes N a while to realise that the boys are actually saying Pils, which is short for Grolsch Pilsner, an imported beer that comes in bottles with a wired ceramic top. But there are real pills too, the amphetamine capsules so central to Josef K's frenetic sound. N only tries them once, to help him through an all-night Monopoly game up at Malk and Susan's flat in Sheens. The power introduces an evil fizzle to his nostrils, and no matter how boring the game gets, N can't fall asleep. N is particularly taken by Malk's punky wife Susan, who grew up in one of the tower blocks in Leith and tells funny stories from a world that might as well be mythological, full of the sort of characters you find in fall songs. The Happy Family at first rehearsed in the same upstairs bedroom that Josef K used in the Ross family home on the Colinton Road. N trips over his new romantic waiter-style trousers, grey, baggy, stripe up the side, in his excitement as he rushes up from the Morningside bus stop. Later, the group practices in a muffled sub-basement in N's dad's language college, which has ping-pong tables and snack machines for breaks. Ian Stoddart contracts Hodgkin's lymphoma and has to be replaced by frenetic Josef K drummer Ronnie Torrance. The de facto leader of the group is bassist Davey. He's probably the one with the best working-class credentials and is rumoured to have been a bit of a housebreaker in his teens. When the windows at the back of the Edinburgh Lounge Foundation are left open one night and burglars make off with some expensive video equipment, Davey is immediately suspected. He denies everything and N transmits the denial to his dad, the college principal. His word is accepted, but N secretly thinks that Davey's friends probably did steal the VCRs and that they had every right to do so. As a socialist, he doesn't really care much about property. The stuff was all insured anyway. It's also socialism that leads N to split the publishing money he receives from Beggars Banquet Music 4 ways, although technically he's the only songwriter. This has the unfortunate result of allowing Davey Weddell to trade in his Starburst bass, a cheap instrument from Woolworths with a uniquely rubbery sound, for a more expensive, more professional Fender jazz bass. The Happy Family stops sounding like Josef K and starts sounding like any other band.
So I inherited the rhythm section from Josef K, and briefly Malcolm Ross on guitar as well. But Malcolm basically put my band, The Happy Family, together really just to give a kind of future work to Davey Weddell, the bass player, Ronnie Torrance, the drummer, although initially we had Ian Stoddart, who later went on to play with Wynne and is alas no longer with us. Paul Haig went solo. There was a kind of inevitable feeling that the group had been hotly tipped by people like Paul Morley and Dave McCulloch, who were the preeminent journalists of the time, and yet somehow failed to keep up with a sudden change in the fashions, a sort of Thatcherite turn in pop music, which saw groups like ABC going for it and making big, shiny, well-produced records, when in fact Josef K wanted to make worse-produced records, or seemed to, because they wanted to make scratchy, live-sounding records. After having Callum Malcolm, who also worked on my first LP, The Man in Your Street, with the Happy Family, in Castle Sound Studios, the same place that Josef K recorded. Callum Malcolm kind of gave them not exactly a glossy sound, but a well-produced sound on their first scrapped album, which is called Sorry for Laughing. They then went back into the studio in Brussels and made a scratchy, amphetamine-fueled, trebly record called The Only Fun in Town, with Paul's vocals mixed way down. So Johnny Johnston gives an account, a pretty journalistic but exciting account, as I see it, of all this stuff happening. And so we ended up playing support slots to The Cure, and I found out from this book that Josef K had gone through all these sort of similar stages supporting The Cure and having trouble getting signed, because all the indie labels back in 1979 were kind of indifferent to them. Rough Trade didn't want to do a deal with them initially. Later they did. I found it much easier to get a deal because I was riding on their coattails, and for people like 4AD who did sign me, my band had wanted to sign Josef K because of all the press attention they were getting, and they were guaranteed this momentum, guaranteed us a certain amount of attention, a little chink in the door to people like John Peel and the Weekly Music Press. So I was very lucky that Josef K had existed and that I had been there at the moment that they split up. I didn't know when I handed a cassette tape to Malcolm Ross in August of 1981 that they were going to split up like the following week, and that Malcolm was going to call me up and say, hey, we should put a group together and record some proper demos, and that was what launched everything for me. Naming myself as Momus after another Kafka character, a minor character in the castle.
Herr Momus is Clam's secretary in the same sense as any of Clam's secretaries, but his official province, and if I'm not mistaken, his official standing, well then his official province but not his official standing, is confined to the village.
Open University. This is BBC Two. Now, Bob Harris introduces this week's edition of the Old Grey Whistle Test.